are now recording. So if you look in the chat, that top link, or you can pull it up from the email, whichever one should be fine. So all right, so let me introduce myself. My name is Joe, Joe Spiker. I work at the Chester Inn Museum. So normally I do exhibits for the museum and displays and that sort of thing. Have either of you been to the museum before? No. Okay. Well, first off, you'll have to come check us out when you get a chance. We have a lot of fun. We do a lot of work. We do a lot of programs. We also do a lot of exhibits. And so what we do, or what I do, is I put this stuff out in the museum for people to come and look at. Last year, we weren't able to really do that. So one of the things that I did last year, sorry about that. Let me see if I can get that to go away. Oh goodness, hang on. I'm having all sorts of technical issues. Hang on just one second. All right, there we go. So last year, the museum closed in March because of the coronavirus pandemic. And the first thing that I was tasked to do was come up with research about the 1918 flu. And it wound up turning into, I found a lot of stuff, did a lot of research, and it turned into an exhibit. And that's what we're going to go through today. So you guys can unmute yourself because I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. The first question I wanted to ask you was about the last year. So how was the last year for you guys? Was it normal? Was it disrupted? Like what was one of the things that changed the most for you last year?
Well, we weren't able to really go. Usually we'd be going like to the zoo and to the aquariums and checking out all the stuff. But then with the pandemic, we had to stay inside.
Yes, that is a big change that happened last year. What about you, Jonathan? What was something that changed for you?
Not really being able to see our friends often. Most of the time it's usually on Zoom.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that's really cool about history is a lot of times when something like this happens, we can look to the past to see if something similar might have happened. And so for you all, you know, the last year not being able to go to the zoo or the aquarium or any of the fun places that you normally go, or not being able to see your friends, that was a really big change for you. And for all of us, we were going through something that we had never been through before. But did you know that something like this has kind of happened before? Did you know that has kind of happened before?
I knew that there was other sort of pandemics, but I didn't know it would be like, I knew about some of the plagues, like about plagues and such from our history school books and such, but I didn't know much about the Spanish flu.
Well, we will find out what happened during this flu in 1918. So let me pull my screen up here for you. So you can see what we've got going on. So if you click that link, so can you see my screen and still hear me? Okay. So if you click that link, it takes you to this big page, right? So if you get a chance after, you know, sometime after we're done with our meeting or sometime later today or or whenever, you can actually go back to this and actually look through everything and read everything. But if you scroll down, there should be a big picture that looks like this. It's like this blue and yellow. Do you all see that? You should be able to click this, and it should bring up another page. Did that work?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what we have here is a bunch of different stuff about the flu. So the two things that we wanted to do with this exhibit was to not only tell people about this flu, but also to relate it to us, right, and our experience in the last year. So for me, as a historian, I love learning about this stuff, right? It's always interesting to learn about anything that happened historically, but in this case, talking about the flu. But the other thing that I'm really interested in is how the people in 1918, like what their experience was like, because that gives us something relatable. So if you go, there are three main parts of the exhibit, okay? There is, the top one is a timeline, and the third one is just a bunch of extra resources that you can go back and look at. But what I wanted to look at first is the newspapers. So if you see the section that says hot off the press and click that, it should take you to our newspaper section of the exhibit. Let me,
Cool.
okay, so do you guys see that? Okay, so what we have done is we've taken a bunch of newspapers and compiled them, we put them together to show like different things that were going on. For example, World War I was happening as the flu broke out. How were people having commercials or advertisements about the flu? What was the advice that people were giving about the flu? How were people entertaining themselves? So we have 8 main things. Oh, sorry, I don't know what I just clicked. Hang on just one second. Put that down here. Let me back out for a second. So we have 8 different headings of the types of news about the flu that tells you how people lived and how people were experiencing these things in 1918. So I'm going to let you all choose the first one that we look at. So look through those headings and see which one you think might be the most interesting to find out about. We've got World War I, the Red Cross, so that's like hospital stuff, community, advertisement.
Maybe Red Cross would be cool.
That would be a great place to start. All right, so let's go here to the Red Cross. And so if you go back and look through this exhibit, we have a bunch of different things. So there are a lot of videos that's basically me telling you about some of the stuff, but since I'm here with you today, I can walk you through this. So what you see with each of these newspaper headlines are newspapers from the time period, right? So these are all from 1918, and this was basically the news about the flu. So how do you all get news today? Like where do you find out information today about stuff that's going on?
Sort of from, people and also sometimes it goes ding and just shows up on some sort of device, and you also can click on TV and watch the news.
That's exactly right. You can talk to people, you can turn on the TV and watch the news. You can get an update on your device, whether it's your iPad that you're using or maybe even your telephone. There are a lot of ways that we get news today. So the last year or so, there's been a lot of news about the coronavirus and the COVID pandemic. And we get that from the TV or the computer or whatever. In 1918, do you think did they have TVs in 1918? No. Did they have computers? No. So the best news source that people had were newspapers. So do you all live in Jonesboro?
Well, we live in Johnson City.
Johnson City is just fine. That's a good place to look too. And that's actually an interesting thing to look at. The first newspaper here is actually from Johnson City. So if you lived in Johnson City in 1918, you had to wait until the newspaper came to find out what was going on. So if you can, let's click on this first Johnson City newspaper. It's the Johnson City Staff. If you click it, it should make it big and you can actually read the newspaper. But this was October 10th, 1918, from a newspaper called the Johnson City Staff newspaper. And let's see here. You should be able to look at it and zoom in on it. And if you're having trouble doing that, I can do it on my end and show it to you here. So hang on just 1 second. Okay, so if you see here, this entire page covers the flu and how the Red Cross was handling the flu in 1918 in Johnson City specifically. So this article tells us about how they were handling this growing health problem in 1918 in the same city that you live in today. So the first thing that comes up are notes about the flu. Now, a couple things that I'll point out to you. It starts off by saying that the Red Cross, which is more of a sort of volunteer or relies on a lot of volunteers, they're working with doctors in town to combat the flu. And it points out that entire families have been stricken and that no nurses are available. So the first thing that they're doing is calling for volunteers. Right. And so what can that tell you about what things might have been like in 1918? If you have to wait on a newspaper to give you news, and in October they're telling you that the flu is so bad that they've run out of nurses and they need volunteers. How do you think people reacted to that sort of news?
Just sort of scared, like this is big. Like this is not like a little sickness, like a cold where you're sick for a few days, but then you get better and such. But this is a really scary thing inside. That's how I feel.
I think that's a great. I think that's a great answer. And so I think you're right about a lot of that. If you read this news, you might be scared, right? And finding out that this particular flu outbreak is so bad. One thing that you pointed out that's a sort of interesting is this isn't the first time that people had seen a flu. The flu had been around for a long time, and there had been different outbreaks of flu before 1918, but this one was really bad. Now that's kind of like the coronavirus, right? There had been different strands of the coronavirus around for a while, but in 2020, the particular type of coronavirus that was hitting everyone was a much different and much worse experience than some of the stuff that had happened previously. And so the way that the newspapers were covering the flu in 1918 is kind of similar to the way that news outlets were covering coronavirus in 2020. Now, one of the things that happened with a lot of the coverage of the COVID pandemic where a lot of people were scared, right? Because it was kind of new, kind of scary. And we had never really experienced something like this before where there was so much uncertainty. But again, it's something I like to point out that it's not the first time that a virus has or a sickness has hit and the news coverage seems kind of scary. But one of the things that is kind of interesting to think about is not only is the news kind of scary, but one of the things that you had pointed out even before talking about the news, Haley, you said that you might get information from other people. So if you're getting information from talking to someone in your neighborhood, or if you know a family that's been stricken down by the flu, you don't need the newspaper to tell you about it. And you might be scared already before you even get to the newspaper. So all this stuff is coming together in 1918 to talk about how serious the flu outbreak really is and what needs to be done to fight it. There's something else in this article. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, yes. So if you look here, one of the last things that is part of this article is a discussion about, it just says influenza. And it's an emergency call for volunteers. And if you look here, it says, I'm trying to zoom in a little bit more. Emergency call, white and colored, graduate nurses, nurses' aides, emergency housekeepers, volunteer cooks and caretakers for children are asked to report to the Red Cross. They would give volunteers hot meals, and they would make sure that hot meals are being delivered to families who are sick. An urgent call for bedding and nightgowns. So when you look at something like this, it shows you what is needed to fight the flu. You have nurses, nurse aides, which you would kind of expect, but you also have a need for housekeepers and cooks and children caretakers. So why do you think during this time with the flu getting so bad, why do you think they were asking for volunteers to help take care of cleaning and cooking and taking care of children?
Maybe because the children, their parents might be sick, but they aren't sick. So the volunteer housekeepers are taking care of the children. And you also need like housekeepers to keep the house and such, and volunteer cooks to make meals for the people.
I think that's exactly right, Haley. That's a great answer. So if at the start of the article, it talks about how many families are becoming sick, then you not only need nurses to help take care of them, but you do also need people to help take care of the house. Imagine whoever does most of the cooking or housekeeping or taking care of you in your house. If they were sick, but you weren't, then someone would need to come in and help take care of that. But things are so bad in 1918 that they need this for a lot of people all at once. So they need volunteers to come and help do that. The other thing that this tells us, right, is this is a good reminder. There is a call specifically for both white and colored people. This is a reminder that in 1918, we are still in the system of segregation in the country, where you had different facilities set up for both white and Black people. And so that's a reminder that that was common in 1918, but it's also a reminder for us historically that that's the time period they were in. But one thing that that also tells us as historians is that all communities, no matter what color, were being impacted by the flu. And that's really important because in 1918, in Johnson City and Jonesboro, in our area, as far as we know, there were not any specific African American newspapers. So there wasn't a whole lot of news coverage that we can go back and learn about how the flu was impacting African American communities in our area. But when you see it pop up like this tells us right off the bat, okay, all the communities in our area were being impacted by the flu, which is another pretty good reminder about how serious this pandemic was for us. Okay, so let's back out of the Red Cross for a minute. And if you're navigating this on your iPad, you should be able to close that tab and get back to the newspaper screen. Are you back here?
Yes.
Okay. Jonathan, do you want to pick the next set of newspapers you want to look at? What's something you might want to learn about?
World War One and influenza.
And yes. All right. So there are a lot of similarities between the COVID pandemic and the 1918 flu. One of the biggest differences is World War One. Do y'all know about World War One a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah. So World War One was a huge war, right? It was a huge war. A lot of people are fighting, especially in Europe. And so for a country like the United States, we get involved in the war in 1917. We send troops over to Europe. So there's a lot of travel back and forth. So if you're moving a lot of different places, and a lot of people are moving all over the country and all over the world, if someone gets sick in Europe and then travels back to America, then they might be bringing that sickness with them. Or if a soldier gets sick in America and then goes to Europe, they're going to be bringing that sickness with them. So that's one of the reasons why the 1918 flu was so bad and spread so quickly, is because just even without a war, it was a pretty bad sickness. But with all the travel and interactions that were going on, it sort of made the flu sort of a lot worse than it actually was. So if you look, let's see, let's pick a Johnson City newspaper. All right, so here is another article from the Johnson City staff. And this was the next day after the Red Cross article we just read. So this was happening right at the same time. Let's see if I can pull this up for you to look at a little bit closer. So if you know a little bit about World War One, and you know about how big of a war it was and how serious of a war it was, this article here is really interesting. So the 1918 flu pandemic at the time was often referred to as the Spanish flu. And in this article here, it talks about how much impact the Spanish flu had on the army. So if you look down here, let's see, influenza or the flu, and pneumonia, which was another sort of offshoot of the flu, in army camps made the death rate among troops at home stations higher during the week ending in October than any other week since the mobilization began. Okay, so this week, the first week in October of 1918, if you were a soldier fighting in World War One in the United States, it was actually deadlier to catch the flu than it was to go to Europe and fight.
Wow.
Which is absolutely nuts when you think about it, especially if you know how serious the war was and how dangerous the fighting was. It was actually more dangerous to get sick with the flu. That's how dangerous this flu pandemic was in 1918. And so a lot of the places that the flu actually hurt or had the biggest impact was on army bases in the United States. So if I was enlisted as a soldier in World War One, but I was stationed somewhere in the United States, it might actually be more dangerous for me there than if I were actually fighting in the battlefields in Europe, which is pretty crazy. Now, let's see, hang on, I'm just trying to pull this up real quick. Okay, so the last couple of weeks in September, the number of soldiers that died in World War I for the United States went from 32 to 81 per 1,000 soldiers. So it almost tripled on how dangerous it was to be in the Army during World War I, which is, again, something that a lot of people maybe don't realize. And so I'm going to pull up another article about World War I here. So this was after the war was over. And this article ran in the Jonesboro newspaper. But this kind of talks about what the Johnson City article points out. According to the latest figures that were issued, the flu pandemic in the United States from September to November, so just in 2 months, killed over 82,000 people, while soldiers in the American Army, only 27 casualties were lost during that time. So 3 or 4 more times more likely to be hurt by the flu than fighting in the war. And this was after the war was over. So this was sort of the final count. And that, I think that gives a really good indication on how serious this this pandemic was for people. But we have time, I think, to look at one more section of news. So let's back out of this and let's look at something, let's see, a little bit more lighthearted. Let's look at entertainment here. So we're going to look at, let's look at entertainment. Okay, so let me ask you all, since the 2 of the things that you had talked about that you were impacted by was not going to the zoo or the aquarium or not spending as much time with your friends. So Haley, over the last year, if you were spending a lot more time at home, how did you spend your free time? How did you entertain yourself?
Well, since it was time to sort of, on the warm days we go outside and such, and on the cooler days we'd play with my brother with our stuffed animals, or play with our figurine animals, and sometimes play blind hide and seek, where the seeker has to have his eyes closed, and just play games like that.
That's okay. First off, blind hide and seek sounds awesome. I'm gonna have to learn that game. Jonathan, did you do a lot of the same things?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that's interesting about entertainment, a lot of the things that you said were ways that people could have entertained themselves in 1918. You could have played with a doll. You could have played with your siblings if you had some handy. If you were in an area where the flu wasn't quite so bad, you might be able to go outside and play with some of your friends. This is really interesting here. So this article is from October of 1918. This is about 10 days after the last articles we looked at, but this is from Bristol. And so this is a list. Let's see here if I can pull this up. This is a list of books that people could read when they were sick, if they were trying to get better, if they were stuck at home waiting for the flu to pass. So this is a list for people who are sick or getting better from flu, and they could be entertained and amused by reading 5-cent extra stories. So have you all ever heard of a story called Happy Hawkins? Does that sound familiar? No. What about Penrod? Does that sound familiar? What about Tarzan?
We've heard about it, but never watched or heard much about it. We just know that he's a guy in the jungle.
Yeah, he's a guy in the jungle. Tarzan was a popular story in 1918, so it's a really old story. But it was Tarzan. There's Tarzan of the Apes, the Beast of Tarzan, and the Return of. There are 3 different Tarzan stories that you could buy for 5 cents and read in 1918 while you were sick with the flu. So these books cost total about 75 cents. But this was a way that if you were stuck at home with the flu, or if your family was sick with the flu, you could occupy yourself. And one of the things that happened a lot in 1918 that you're talking about today, a lot of places were closed. Businesses closed for a while, schools closed, some churches closed. So that's something that we were kind of doing for the first time and seemed kind of scary, but it's something that people were doing in 1918 because of the flu that they were going through. So we've got a few minutes left, and I wanted to take this time to let you guys ask any questions that you might have. So do you have any questions about anything?
How long was the Spanish flu around?
That is a really good question. I'm gonna back out, and you can do this too if you would like, but I can show it here. So the first section of our exhibit has a timeline of stuff. And so if you go, one of the timelines covers different newspaper articles and puts them all together. So to answer your question, the flu in 1918, kind of like the coronavirus, had a couple of different waves or phases. And so there actually might be a better one to look at for this. So the phase that we're talking about in like September, October, November, that was the deadliest part. And that part lasted for about 3 or 4 months. But the flu lasted, the Spanish flu lasted in over a year. It was still impacting people in 1919 into 1920. It wasn't as bad. The worst part was about 3 or 4 months in 1918 and 1919. One of the, let's see here. One of the external resources that you can pull up in the exhibit, there are a couple of timelines here. So this shows the timeline. The first mention of the flu came in April of 1918. The second wave is the most dangerous and sets in by September. And then in April of 1919, it had started to die down a little bit. So over a year, it was around. Which is a really good question. Did you have a second question or anything else you might be curious about?
Can mom ask a question?
Most definitely.
Oh, cool. Well, I was just wondering, you had mentioned about the soldiers and how deadly the flu was for them. I guess something I was wondering, like COVID-19 generally seems to affect the older population more, with some exceptions, but more so than the other. Was the Spanish flu, did it pretty much affect all ages equally, or was the impact much more on the older populations?
So that's also a really good question. One of the things that really jumped out about this particular flu outbreak is typically with a flu like that, the elderly and newborns, like really young children, they're always kind of susceptible to this stuff, right?
Right.
One of the things that was really scary about this particular flu is people who were like 9 to 50 were also really hurt. So if, as part of the exhibit, if you go to the local death records and timelines, we have Carter County and Washington County. So since you guys live in Washington County, you might be more interested in looking at this. But you can pull up both. So when you pull this up, there's a whole lot of stuff here and you can navigate it around in different ways. Excuse me. But we have an overall breakdown by ages. The age range for each month from October to January, which again was like the time when things were the worst. So in October of 1918, when the flu really sets in this area, there were only 5 people that died over the age of 51. That was actually the lowest age range. People between the ages of 15 and 24, 12 people died. And between the ages of 25 and 50, 16 people died. That's just as some context. Now, in Washington County, it actually got, like, after October, it kind of calmed down a little bit. So there were only 44 people died of the flu in October. But then like 14 people died in November, 19 in December, and only 5 people died in January. But the age breakdowns are there, and each month, the 15 to 24 or 25 to 50 was either the first or second highest age range. The 51 and older was always one of the lowest age ranges for each month.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. If you look at Carter County, for comparison, their October wasn't as bad, but all the other months were worse than Washington County's. So in October of 1918, again, only 3 people over the age of 51 died. People 15 to 24, 3 people died. 25 to 50, 6 people died. It was really hard on young people under the age of 5 in Carter County. 20 children under the age of 5 died from the flu just in October of 1918. And that age range was actually the highest each month in Carter County. But the second highest age range for most of the months were either 15 to 24 or 25 to 50. In December of 1918, that changed. There were 6 people over the age of 51 that died. That was the second highest age range. But we have those totals broken down on the timelines, and it's really interesting to look at, because, like, the elderly and the young children were sort of always the targets for those. But with this flu, like, you had a lot of teenagers, a lot of high school students, a lot of people in their 20s who were dying from this, and really sort of unexpectedly.
Well, thank you for going over that. That was when you mentioned about the soldiers. I was just thinking that's probably late teens, early 20s, maybe 30s, and I thought that's really shocked me to hear that. that was, the age range where it seemed like a lot of people were succumbing to the illness and stuff.
Yeah, that's that was one of the things that stood out most about this pandemic. So, well, did you have any other final thoughts or questions?
Feeling I had one, but I lost it.
Everyone but love, that happens to me a lot too. You have been talking about earlier, I think that, like, were they able to know that it was a Spanish flu and not just another flu or illness? Like, back then, were they Mr. Spiker, is that right? Is it
Yes,
Spiker?
yes.
Okay,
Yes.
make sure I'm pronouncing it right. Mr. Spiker might be able to tell you that I sort of assumed that they probably had some way to know if it was a Spanish flu. For example, with COVID, you hear some people say, oh, they don't have COVID, they just have a regular flu, a regular cold, but they do a test. Back then, did they have that ability to do tests and figure out, is it really the Spanish flu, or is it bacterial pneumonia or something else that got them?
Well, there were so that's that's an interesting question. So, like, if you might have COVID today, right? If you look up the symptoms, there are a lot of similarities to a bunch of other things, like runny nose, sneezing. Like, a lot of the symptoms are pretty similar. So if you're just going by symptom, respiratory is a big indicator, right? That you might,
Right.
like, breathing problems might be a good indication. But today we have a way to, like, you can get an instant test now and find out pretty soon if you have COVID or not. They did not have that in 1918. They didn't have tests like that. There were signs and symptoms, especially if it lingered around longer than what a normal flu would linger. Your breathing, and breathing problems, you tended to have more respiratory issues with this flu versus some of the other ones. One of the problems that came up with this flu wasn't necessarily the flu itself, but also, like, people would get pneumonia after having this flu or while they had it. And so breathing and breathing problems were one of the biggest indicators as to how people thought it was this particular flu. And then also the severity, like, it hit harder than some other flus did. But, they did recognize that it was different. Like, if you look at a lot of these articles that we have, they call it the Spanish flu or Spanish influenza to mark it as different than some of the other flus that had been going on.
Well, thank you. That answered our question. Was that what you were thinking of?
I think it
Yes.
That's okay. If you think about it, you can always email me and I will answer any questions that you have.
may be.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This was really interesting. Jonathan, do you have anything else to ask Mr. Spiker about anything? No. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate this. This was really interesting. My grandmother, who actually turns
I remember
104 today, she
I
lived through
remember
this.
now.
Yes, Haley.
Did they have like a vaccine for it or something? Because, like, I didn't know, like, was there any cure for it, or was it like no cure?
There was not really a cure, and I'm not 100% sure when, because you can get a flu shot now, right? To kind of protect you from some parts of some flus. I don't know. I think that there was a specific vaccine that came up for this, but I think it was years and years later. It wasn't like, we've already got a COVID vaccine that's in place now. It was not that fast. Don't hold me to that. I will try to look into that and email that information out. But I don't. It was not anytime soon. To this. So.
Okay.
But. All right. Well, thank you all for joining in. Did you say your grandmother was 104?
Yes, she turned 104 today. We went over on Monday and celebrated with her, and today she's 104. So we had asked her some things about the Spanish flu, but she was, of course, very, very young, but she had remembered hearing stories about it and stuff. And she had some memory about the illness, but she said it doesn't compare to now with COVID.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Well, happy birthday to her. That's awesome. Well, like I said, if now you've got the link, you can go back and look through this stuff as you know, whatever parts of it. There's a lot of really neat information in here, but you get to see as an exhibit, there will be like articles, but then there's also like our explanation of like what this stuff means and compares to today. So yeah, lot of fun. So you guys did awesome. Thank you for your participation. You did really good. So,
Oh, well, thank you. I think this may be one of our favorite field trips that we've done this year. Thank you so much.
you're welcome. Well, thank you all. If you need anything, you can email us and we'll answer any questions that you have. And we look forward to having you back somehow, either with another program or stop by the museum sometime, and we'll be glad to give you a tour.
And this is the one in Jonesboro, right?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned Carter County, and they've been a couple times to the one at Sycamore Shoals, that museum, but they've never been. We'll have to try to go to the one in Jonesboro.
Yeah, well, starting in May, we're open 6 days a week. We're open every day but Tuesday.
And I was PowerPoint here. Can I share this with people? Is this okay, or is this something that belongs to the?
No, yeah, this is totally fine to share. This is up online in our digital exhibit hall, but share this with as many people as you'd like. There's actually a part on the main exhibit page when you're actually navigating around where you can go into a community forum. I don't think anybody's put anything in here yet, but there's a part where you can add your own stories and stuff. So yeah, definitely share this with as many people as you'd like. We'd love that.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
All right, you have a great day. Thank you again.
All right, you too.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.